Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. What is Independent Diplomat? What is Independent Diplomat doing to provide services in countries such as Syria and the Marshall Islands, especially in the area of climate change? We'll be back in just a moment to talk about these and other important issues. Welcome back to our program. Today we're taking a look at an organization, a very interesting organization, Independent Diplomat. And my guest is an expert on Independent Diplomat. My guest is Mr. Carne Ross. Mr. Carne Ross is the Executive Director of Independent Diplomat. Previously, Mr. Ross was in the British Foreign Office and United Nations, working on a wide range of issues and regions, including Europe, the Middle East, Africa, global environment, terrorism, and post-conflict reconstruction. Carne Ross, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thanks for having me.
I appreciate you being with me today. Let's talk about Independent Diplomat. When was it formed? Why was it formed? What do you do basically?
Well, there's a kind of personal reason why it was formed. I had resigned from the British Foreign Office over the Iraq War, and I needed something to do, and I didn't want to leave diplomacy, and I realized there was a kind of gap in diplomacy, which was that very often in diplomatic forums, the people most affected by the discussions in those forums were absent from those discussions. So when I'd been on the UN Security Council, we'd be talking about Iraq, Palestine, Kosovo. You could guarantee that the Iraqis, the Kosovars, the Palestinians, the people from those places would not be present. And so I decided to found Independent Diplomat back in 2004 to address that, what I call a diplomatic deficit.
And that's what you focus on.
That's what we do. We take democratic political groups, movements, and countries around the world whose future is being discussed in the diplomatic process, the formal diplomatic process of one kind or other, and we help them represent themselves more effectively in those diplomatic processes so that they can achieve their objectives, but above all to make sure that their voice is heard, because we believe not only is that just for them, that they should actually be heard in the discussion about them, but secondly that it produces better diplomatic outcomes if you actually listen to the people most concerned. It's kind of obvious logic, but it's a logic unfortunately that's not really reflected in the way diplomacy is practiced today.
Now on your website you have 3 service areas that you focus upon. I think you already started to talk about those. One is political strategy, the other international law, and then public diplomacy and media strategy. How do those 3 come together, just very briefly?
Well, those 3 seem to us to be the 3 main pillars of effective diplomacy. Political strategy, obviously how you position yourself, what kind of message you're delivering to other countries, actors in the diplomatic system. International law, what is your status in international law? How can you use international law to advance your objectives? And public diplomacy, PR if you like, for countries and political movements, social media, TV, traditional media like newspapers. How do you use that to get your message across in a way that changes international policy about you?
And getting your message across, you have a website. It's www.independenttdiplomat.org, and your Twitter handle is @diplomat.
So at iDiplomat.
At iDiplomat, thank you. Small type.
Yeah.
Okay, very good. Well, let's talk, I mentioned in the opening about the Marshall Islands. And we've heard a lot about climate change, which is impacting especially so many of the islands in the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. Marshall Islands are certainly one of those areas being adversely affected. Let's talk about the recent United Nations conference, what they call the COP21 that was held in Paris. This was a major gathering that produced an agreement by all 196 governments in attendance at this. What was the thrust of that meeting? Why was it important? And then we'll talk about how it's impacting the Marshall Islands and what you're doing with the Marshall Islands.
Well, it's important because it's the first genuinely global international agreement to deal with climate change, where every country that's a member of the UN accepted that climate change is a problem and needs to be addressed. and where they committed to take action. Every country that signed the Paris Agreement committed to cut its own carbon emissions. They had to submit their own national targets, and it agreed a framework for reviewing those commitments, and it agreed a framework for compensating countries that are damaged by climate change. So that's the significance of the agreement. It is of epic significance. It's the first truly global international agreement where everybody makes commitments to address climate change. Our role in that process was that we supported the Marshall Islands, the Republic of the Marshall Islands, in their attempts to have their needs addressed in that negotiation. As you said, they're one of the most vulnerable countries to climate change, to sea level rise in the world. They're an archipelago of low-lying islands where sea level rise is already causing repeated floods and salination of the water supplies. So they're extremely concerned about climate change and how it can be mitigated, but also how they can get the funds to adapt to it. Both are concerns for the Marshall Islands. So we worked through them and we supported them, and their foreign minister, in particular Tony de Bruyn, became a very powerful advocate for a highly ambitious agreement in Paris and was recognized as such. He played an extraordinary role in giving the most vulnerable countries a voice.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And this whole issue of climate change is just impacting every country in the world. There's probably no country that's not being adversely affected. If there is, I don't think we've read about that particular country. It seems that the majority of the players around the world have come together and agreed that climate change is taking place. It is happening. The glaciers are melting. The seas are rising.
It's not the majority. It's every country in the world.
Every country, except the United States Congress, perhaps. That may be one of the few places.
They're not a country.
They're not a country. Exactly right. So the important thing is that they've agreed that they're going to move forward. And one thing I think they've agreed upon is they have to move away from fossil fuels. You have to get away from coal, oil, gas. They're creating a huge carbon footprint. How did they have to come to the realization that they can do that and still not eliminate jobs, not destroy their economies, but actually have healthier, safer, and more prosperous economies by switching to alternative fuels?
Well, that particular discussion wasn't really part of the diplomatic negotiation. Paris was about common commitments to try to reach a carbon-free future by 2050. That was a target agreed in Paris that nobody really expected, and that was driven by the Marshall Islands and the other most vulnerable countries who said we've got to work for a carbon-free world. It's not just enough to reduce our emissions, we've got to stop using carbon, stop emitting carbon completely if we're not going to cause runaway climate change. So that was a really, really important commitment that was made in Paris. It's not had a lot of media attention, but it was a central thing that many people who'd been part of these negotiations for many years didn't really expect that level of ambition. In terms of how countries get to carbon-free economies, that's left up to them. I don't think the UN and countries sitting in a stuffy conference room in Paris should be discussing the mechanics of how you adapt your economy, how you adapt machinery, your manner of work, your energy systems to being carbon-free. Everybody knows these are complex issues. It doesn't really belong in a diplomatic negotiation. It's now up to the countries concerned to meet the targets that they've now declared in the Paris Agreement.
And they've agreed upon the targets, and now it's up to them to put the machinery in place, the strategy to achieve these.
Yes, and they'll be reviewed every 5 years. This was a proposal made by the Marshall Islands, in fact, that their commitments to cut carbon, their INDCs, as they're called in the jargon, be reviewed every 5 years, and that they come back to the table in 5 years' time and come with better targets, more ambitious targets in 5 years' time. So it's what we call the ratchet, to drive further ambition, lower emissions all the way through the life of this agreement. So what we're looking at is a global agreement that will endure for a long time as the mechanism which will reduce carbon emissions. Nobody pretends that Paris alone is enough. The combined targets of all the countries that signed up to Paris is not enough to get us below the 1.5 degrees centigrade in temperature rise that is the target of the agreement. So hopefully, however, in the future, the mechanism set up by the agreement will be a ratchet to force countries to submit more and more ambitious carbon emissions targets.
Exactly. Now you're working with the Marshall Islands, and there are some countries that are moving very aggressively. One that comes to mind is Denmark. I think Germany is becoming a solar power, trying to get 40% of its electricity or energy from solar plates and that type of thing. Does the Marshall Islands, do they have an official policy to move completely away from carbon-based fuels and to clean energy such as solar, wind, whatever it might be?
Yes, they do. In fact, they have a very aggressive policy to alter their dependence on carbon-based energy to what's called OTEC, which again is another technical term, but it's basically using thermal currents in the sea to produce energy. And they have a plant that's just been opened in the Marshall Islands to produce energy of that kind, and their ambition is to move to a completely sustainable, renewable energy as the basis of their economic activity.
Now, you have clients, Marshall Islands being one of them, of your clients. And I forgot to ask you this in the opening. Are you a 501c3 nonprofit organization?
We're a nonprofit,
Nonprofit.
And we take philanthropic funding because most of our clients, as we call them, because we serve them, do not have the ability to pay what it costs to run Independent Diplomat. So we take philanthropic funding from foundations, individuals, and indeed some friendly governments to do this work.
Another hot topic is Syria, another area of the world that has the spotlight on it because, for obvious reasons, what's going on with the outmigration of refugees, a horrendous carnage that's taking place in Syria. What is your involvement? What's Independent Diplomat doing in Syria to help deal with some of these problems?
Well, for 2 years we've been supporting the Syrian National Coalition, which is the umbrella group of several different groups who support a democratic future for Syria. And they have been engaged in demanding a transition from the Assad regime, demanding the end of the Assad regime. And at the moment, for instance, they're preparing for the possible resumption of diplomatic talks, including with the regime itself, with a view to ending the war. So we've been supporting them in that endeavor.
When you look at the different groups, and apparently there must be dozens and dozens. Thousands, which makes it even more of a challenge. It seems as though when we talk about the strategy in Syria, at least as far as working with the groups that are democratically leaning, shall we say, that some people are saying that it's difficult to identify who they are because you have so many different ideologies, you have so many different backgrounds, you have so many people with different agendas. Have you been able to do that? Have you identified a large number of democratically focused groups that truly want a democracy in Syria?
I don't think it's difficult to assume that most people in Syria want democracy and peace. That's what most people want everywhere. They want government that represents them, and they want peace to bring up their children and prosperity. That's what almost everybody wants. So I think the ideological differences between groups in Syria are somewhat overstated. What the Vienna process is trying to agree, and what indeed every country, including all the members of the Security Council, have in the past agreed in the so-called Geneva Communique, is that there should be a transition to democracy in Syria. The question is how that happens and how long the Assad regime and Assad himself will endure in that process. That is the point of difference between most of the countries, or the key countries, in particular the US, Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, those countries discussing the future of Syria. There are, of course, some groups on the ground who want something that is entirely incompatible with that vision of the future of Syria, which is, of course, Daesh, the Islamic State, and they're not included in that diplomatic discussion.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is an independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We would encourage our viewers to go to www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you have any linkages to media outlets such as PBS, Community Access Television, or some college or university intra-campus television system, please feel free to go to our website and go to the broadcaster's icon and pull down these programs because they are free to the public and are provided as a public service. Today we're talking about a very interesting group, Independent Diplomat, and what Independent Diplomat's doing to help negate some of the challenges of climate change with the Marshall Islands and to help promote peace and stability in Syria. My guest today is an expert on Independent Diplomat. My guest today is Mr. Carne Ross. Mr. Carne Ross is the Executive Director of Independent Diplomat. Carne, we're talking about the situation in Syria. And it's very difficult to predict what's going to happen. Obviously, as soon as we predict something today, it'll change tomorrow, I'm sure. What do you think is going to happen, and what would you like to see happen as far as bringing peace and stability to that very war-racked a troubled area of the world.
What I think it's utterly pointless somebody like me engaging in predictions. Everybody knows the range of what spectrum of what might happen from continued war, greater disintegration, massive humanitarian suffering to something much better than that, and nobody knows which it will be. I think my ideal is one that is shared by a great many people in Syria, and also, frankly, by most countries in the international community, is of some kind of ordered transition to democracy and a marginalization of the extremist forces that have contributed to conflict in Syria. And by that I include the Assad regime. It's important to remember that this war would not be happening were it not for the Assad regime. This war will continue as long as the Assad regime is in power. And it is the Assad regime, now with Russia in support of them, that is killing by far the largest number of civilians, even compared to Daesh and ISIS. But ISIS also is a force, a group of people who has no future in a stable Syria. As long as they exist on the ground and have control over areas, you will not have stability in Syria, just like as long as the regime is still around, you won't have stability in Syria. So between those two extremes, we've got to forge consensus about a democratic future for Syria. I don't think that's impossible. I actually think there is a degree of agreement on that basic proposition in the international community and indeed amongst people in Syria. But of course, that consensus on that broad ambition doesn't mean you agree on the details of how to get there.
And of course, our viewers can go to www.independentdiplomat.org and get much more information on your various programs and projects that you have underway. Let's talk a little bit about Iran. That's another country that's received a lot of publicity lately. And not too long ago, several months ago, there was a major agreement cracked between the Iranians and 6 of the major players at the United Nations to try to work with Iran to make sure that Iran does not develop a nuclear weapon. How do you perceive that agreement, and why is that an important agreement to focus on this particular issue?
Well, I'll take a slightly heretical view here, which is I think it's far less important than most Americans have been making out, including those who oppose it and those who support it. And I think that recent history has made clear that the agreement itself has not made Iran, this malleable cooperator in the future of the Middle East. We still have tremendous dissent between Iran and its neighbors, Saudi Arabia, to which, of course, Saudi Arabia itself contributes. Iran is still playing a very negative role in Syria, where it supports the regime, has deployed troops in support of the regime, etc., etc. So I don't see this agreement, the nuclear agreement, as the end of a chapter and the beginning of an entirely new happy chapter in the West's or anybody's relations with Iran. That improvement has yet to come. On the other hand, there had to be agreement on the nuclear issue before anyone could move forward, and sanctions were lifted as a result of are being lifted as a result of the nuclear agreement, and I think that's been incredibly important. I have always been in favor of engaging Iran. However, I would have preferred to see engagement with Iran across a much broader range of concerns and not just the nuclear issue. The nuclear issue is at heart a security concern, and I would have liked to have seen a broader discussion about security in the Middle East and security guarantees between Iran and its neighbors and indeed the United States and potentially even Israel, because those security concerns lie at the heart of why Iran was pursuing a nuclear weapon in the first place. So in a sense, we've just dealt with the symptoms, not the real cause. And Iran has got to be part of the discussion of what a future stable Middle East might look like. And clearly we're very, very, very long way from that discussion bearing fruit.
Is it not possible in the future to have that discussion, to talk about the broader security issue for the Middle East as we move forward into this agreement and with other areas of negotiation and areas of agreement between the Iranians and some of the other key players? Can we expand that discussion?
I think we're in a very interesting and unstable period in the Middle East. Doesn't take a genius to see that, but one of the things that has changed in recent years is the assumption of outsiders, including people like me, that basically the United States was holding the ring of this region, of who was talking to who, of what this topic of discussion would be. That has changed. The US has essentially begun an epic strategic withdrawal from the Middle East, and that has been sensed by the main players in the Middle East. But what has not yet replaced an American-dominated dispensation is one where the regional players pick up the slack and engage in diplomacy with each other. Instead, what we're seeing is growing hostility between the regional players, in particular between Saudi Arabia and Iran, a confrontation which underlies a lot of the conflict that we're seeing across the Middle East, including in Yemen and, of course, in Syria, but also beyond. And I'm deeply worried that the basic drivers of conflict in the Middle East seem to be getting worse, not better. Autocracy seems to be becoming more and more established, and in turn that is creating greater extremism. But the governments concerned, who in theory should be the bringers of order and stability, are not taking their responsibilities to deal with each other seriously, to hammer out what stability should look like.
You're talking about instability in the Middle East, and many of the historians and foreign policy analysts and different folks like that have focused on a large part of the instability today was caused by the invasion of Iraq in March of 2003 by the Bush-led coalition. And today you can trace a lot of the problems right back to that particular issue. And of course, at that time we saw where the administration and the allies put out a lot of misinformation, disinformation about Saddam Hussein's threat, this bogus threat of having nuclear weapons, and just on across the board. The whole thing was a gerrymandered excuse to invade a country, a sovereign country, really. It was an illegal invasion of a sovereign country. You were right in the middle of that. You were right there watching this whole thing unfold. What are some of the lessons that came out of that, and can we apply them today, especially as we hear some of the neoconservatives, such as former Vice President Dick Cheney, such as Paul Wolfowitz, people like that who were totally wrong when it came to Iraq and are prescribing the same solutions for dealing with Iran and some other areas today. What lessons have we learned from 2003 that we could apply today as we have a discussion of how to deal with these problems and not look to military force, which seems to be counterproductive and always takes us down the wrong road?
Well, oddly, that's not a conclusion I would share, because I think military force is sometimes necessary, and I think it should have been deployed much earlier in Syria, for instance, to support those supporting democracy in Syria and to stop the regime killing its own people. I think there should be a no-fly zone in Syria, a no-bombing zone, because it's the regime bombing its own people that is the major cause of civilian suffering. And I think that could be stopped very easily, and it should be stopped. And a kind of knee-jerk reaction against all military intervention, I think, is an unsubtle and crude response to that problem. But my own personal conclusion from what I witnessed as the UK's Iraq expert at the UN Security Council before 2003, so I had an intimate and sophisticated knowledge of the issues of WMD, weapons inspections, and all the rest of it. I helped set up UNMIVIC, the UN weapons inspection body. My conclusion from it is don't trust your governments. They don't tell you the truth, even when they seem like they do. They don't really know what they're doing. I'm afraid that's a very bitter and harsh lesson, but I'm afraid I think it's borne out by my experience and indeed, a more general empirical examination of what took place. It's not only that governments are quite prepared to mislead their own populations in the most extreme and grave circumstances, like a war, which is what we did, of course, see. The Bush and Blair governments grievously misled their own people. They claim to this day that they were misled by the intelligence. That's not true. The intelligence was very clear. There was no threat from Iraq. That's what we believe. That's what we would say to our American counterparts when we had UK-US talks about the matter. But I think more seriously, one of the things I realized on reflection after my experience dealing with the Middle East at the UN Security Council and for the British government was that we don't really understand these places. And it's not because we're no good at Arabic or because, we don't know enough Middle East history, both of which are true, but it's because they're simply too complicated. The interpretation of truths from the ground to the diplomatic level, to the, rather grandiose high government officials who make policy, that transmission of information doesn't work. Only the people on the ground really know their reality. And the people far distant up in government chancelleries making these simplistic decisions about what might work or what won't work are almost invariably just shooting in the dark. And that, I think, is a much more troubling conclusion than just the neocons are wrong and it was all Cheney. I don't, whilst I think those people behaved in an odious and dishonest fashion, I think what I drew from it is a much more serious long-term reservation about the nature of the system itself and how we address political issues, economic issues globally in general.
Mm-hmm. Well, Carne Ross with Independent Diplomat, these are very important issues, and it's very important to discuss them and to look at them from all different angles and to try to hammer out a policy, or policies, I should say, to help bring peace and stability, whether we're dealing with climate change or we're dealing with the situation in Syria or the invasion of Iraq or whatever the case might be. But it's important that we discuss them and that we learn much more about them. And we certainly have today. And I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you, Bill. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.